Hey folks, BlackCross here, and today I'm going to be doing a review on Mortal Shells. If you don't know, Mortal Shells is an indie development title game that is heavily inspired by the Souls franchise. Which, for those that are curious, no is not just because of difficulty, but rather the gameplay experience followed by the atmosphere as well as the detail that the game actually has. So what makes Mortal Shells somewhat like Dark Souls aside from the difficulty? Well, there's actually quite a bit. For starters, the gameplay function is practically almost similar to that of Dark Souls, except for a few extra mechanics added into it. You have the fact that you attack with R1, and you use your strong attack with R2, you dodge with circle, but what's even more interesting is the fact that there are other mechanics featured into the game as well. For starters, technically there's an extra mechanic known as Harden, which basically turns your entire body hardened, and this basically helps you withstand an opponent attack, allowing you to get a swift blow into the opponent. What's interesting about this mechanic is that not only does this work in terms of the field of combat like an extra shield barrier, but it also acts like as if sort of like a being able to avoid attack in order to strike into the enemy. So say, for example, you're fixing to strike an enemy with a heavy attack, and a heavy attack normally takes a while to charge up in order to be used. So to prevent yourself from being ruined of that damage potential, you can use Harden as the enemy's fixing to attack you, and as it deflects the attack, you are able to then finish that combo and thus dealing the final blow to that enemy. This also works well against bosses and other type things, and it's very handy in my personal opinion. I think this is actually pretty clever ideal usage when it comes down to it. Much like when it comes to stamina, however, though, this requires a charge for a few seconds to where you can then harden again later on. You also have a parry in this game, which to a degree I guess the parry's okay. Never been good with parries in the video games of Dark Souls, really. Bloodborne, I like the parry in that one personally better. But in terms of Dark Souls fashion, the parry in this one is actually pretty good. You do actually, however, get a variety of different parries, though, aside from the main parry that you actually get in the game. Now, aside from the gameplay perspective, there's also another level of mechanic as well, and that is known as shells. So in Mortal Shells, basically you have 4 different shells to choose from, and these shells ranges from in terms of certain particular stat elements that they feature in. For example, one of them features a heavy inducence of stamina, allowing you to do more damage followed by run for further distances. But your HP, however, though, is a lot more smaller compared to the other 3. And then you have one that has a large amount of HP, however, though, he is also very slow, and mostly all of them do the same type of attack power when it comes down to it. All of them are basically the same in terms of attack power. The only difference is either based on stamina, HP, or in some cases, ability points when needed to be. The thing though, however, that while technically you do get currency in the game, you don't actually level up in the game. Instead, you earn passive abilities with these different shells that you can actually possess in. And these passive abilities ranges from either being withstandable to certain potential poise damage, perhaps maybe even immune to poison for that matter. In some cases, they even have better abilities that help you withstand the flow of battle. It just depends on what they are and which character has them, of course. Or shells in this case, should I say. So while technically you don't actually level up in the game and instead you get passive abilities, what's the point in having the shells? Well, because your main character is basically a one hit away from death. Yeah. Essentially, this is basically Dark Souls, the Soul Level 1 edition, except you have to pick whatever shells you want if you want to withstand any particular damage. Another thing too about this game is the fact that technically you don't have a wide range of weapons to choose from. If nothing else, technically you have upwards to 4, even potentially 5 different sets of weapons. I say potentially 5 because the 5th one is basically what you would call a Basilisk Bazooka, which is basically what you would call a crossbow bazooka size. I'm not even kidding. Whenever you finally get the ability to get the tool to make the weapon, per se, it's pretty powerful. The only problem, though, however, it takes forever to load up, much like a bazooka, of course. But aside from that, you have 4 different weapons to choose from, and really most of them are either somewhat similar or yet something different, for that matter. Personally, I actually prefer using the twin type weapon, the hammer and dagger. That one I actually kind of liked it a little bit better, but I'm not going to deny whenever I say the other three are just as handy, if not just as useful, based on the situation you may put yourself into. For example, you may prefer the staff, in which where it provides fire element. You have another one which implements an ice element, and then you have your main sword that you start off with. So, I mean, in some cases, some of these weapons are pretty handy, depending, but keep in mind you only have upwards of 4 different weapons to choose from. So while variety of weapons and variety of shells isn't so well maxed out, the reality is, though, is that in terms of demonstration, they're actually done quite well. For starters, your first main weapon that you start off with, technically in the main area of Fulgrim, which is the hub area world, you could potentially find 2 particular items that allowed the weapon to be able to use 2 different sets of abilities. These 2 different sets of abilities can be triggered either via by R1 command or R2 command. And this requires ability points needed, which is basically the highlighted bar that sits above your HP bar. Once you initiate those ability points, they will actually implement damage to the enemy. Of course, depending on the ability itself, depends on if it's able to avoid any particular iframes that it may induce, or it may very well take in those iframes and thus canceling the ability altogether. Again, personally, I prefer the hammer and dagger weapon, which is basically a dual weapon on its own, due to its flexibility followed by its amount of damage that it can deliver based on stamina usage. However, though, one of its ability points can actually be potentially ruined if the timing is not on par. In other words, you need to be careful with the timing of that particular attack. Whereas most of these other ones, you could potentially avoid any potential iframe damage that could ruin the combo itself. Which is actually interesting because these ability points can actually be used in a form of a combo attack. Which is something that I didn't think a lot of people would actually consider thinking about until, like, say, for example, Dark Souls 3 implemented the second phase weapon abilities. This is actually something that came from, of course, Bloodborne, but Dark Souls improved it to a little bit of degree. And in my personal opinion, I think Mortal Shells did really well in integrating this particular form of attack. There are, however, other items that allows you to do other stuff, like increase the weapons attack and stuff of that nature. But here's the thing, you have to find them either out into the area itself or earn them either through shops or NPCs, of course. And that's the interesting thing, while the world map themselves aren't exactly huge, like they're not humongous in any form of way, they actually provide quite some interesting items that can help you along the way. And speaking of items, this is something of an interesting mechanic that's actually inside the game, and that is familiarity. Familiarity actually plays a big part in the game, in which where the first time you use the item, it doesn't really affect as much, or it actually hurts you depending. For example, there's actually a mushroom that as soon as you eat it, it actually poisons you. But the more you consume it, eventually you will be immune to poison damage whenever being used. And then, of course, that also follows by the healing items that you can attain in the game. The more you consume it, the more health it can regenerate as you use it. So in other words, the more usage you get out of it, the better the item's going to be. You also have the fact that the bosses are pretty good. Unfortunately, there's not a huge variety of bosses, I admit, but in terms of the demonstration of these bosses, they're actually really fun and entertaining to actually engage into whenever you're able to fight them, and whenever you get good enough at the game. In the game, you have to fight off against 3 particular bosses in order to bring out a particular item to a particular person. By the time you do that, you then beat that person and end the game. And then, of course, much like in Dark Souls fashion, you then go through a new Game Plus format. But I'm going to warn you, there are a lot of challenges that are in the game that have been to be enabled in terms of trophy support. For example, you have to beat the game while not using any of the 4 mentioned shells. Yes, in other words, 1 hit damage, you're not going to go through far very much in this game. There's also another trophy in which where you have to play Dark Obsidian Armor, which I have not done that, nor am I going to, because I don't know what that's going to imply, because chances are, as hard as the game is right now, I don't see myself actually platinuming this game, even though I've platinumed most Soulsborne game. with the exception of Sekiro, of course. But aside from the gameplay mechanic and everything like that, what else makes the game interesting? Well, a lot of the smaller detail stuff that the game actually features. For example, it does have a lore in it, and the lore is not just found within its items, it's also found within the world itself. There are these little monuments where you can read scriptures and stuff that tells the lore of the world. Followed by that, you also have the fact that the individual shells and the individual abilities that you get also tells the lore as well. So that also plays the same factor of how Dark Souls have been. Each item that you find actually tells the story of that particular area in regards to its lore. So it's the same way in this game too. But there's more to that. There's actually a charm to this game. And so much more that I actually would recommend this highly in terms of games that you should play if you're a Souls fan. And this is definitely one of the ones that I would recommend personally because of the charm that it has. For example, there is an instrument known as a lute that you can play in the game, and the more familiar you are, the better sounding it's going to be. Naturally, of course. But what's interesting is that how it actually sounds. It's actually quite peaceful, I ain't gonna lie. When you're in a quiet enough area, you can actually hear the music, the lute play, and it's actually quite peaceful and enjoyment. In fact, I'm actually kind of surprised that this was introduced. I kind of wish that Dark Souls or Bloodborne would feature some kind of instrument as well. I wouldn't even care what it is. I just wouldn't mind actually having a point in the game where you can just sit down for a brief moment, allow yourself to be absorbed into the atmosphere, and allow the music to kind of play itself through in that little moment of quietness, you know? While you're fighting enemies and stuff like that, you may be slightly exhausted, you may just want to sit down and play the lute for a little bit, which is actually pretty enjoyable experience, I think. And it technically also plays part in a trophy, which happens to be one of my personal favorite trophies, and it's also technically an ending. And I have to say, I kind of like the ending personally on that part. It's not a mandatory ending, but I think I like it better, actually, personally. There's also another thing where basically you can pet a cat in the game. Yes, a Souls-like game in which where you can pet a cat. Can't do that in Dark Souls, nor can you do that in Bloodborne. This game's already better by that factor alone. Two other small things, and this is mostly for those who are linked up online, and that's the fact that technically on one end, you can actually download a metal patch that allows it to play metal music during a boss fight. This is actually pretty interesting, and it's something that I actually kind of like. It was one of those things where it's like, I guess it makes sense if you want to play it first time through without the metal music, just for that factor that when you're playing it first time through, you wouldn't really get to recognize the metal music. However though, once you enable this free patch, you can actually listen to the metal music as an option while fighting the bosses, and this is actually really groovy. I actually really like it. It's one of those things where it's like, this isn't bad, this is actually really cool. And again, it's a free DLC, so you're not losing anything out of it. Another thing though, however, is more of a free event thing, in which where based on the season, you can get free costumes. Basically, you talk to this frog, and by giving him certain food and stuff, he will barf out different color skins for your shells. So this is something that's right now going through an autumn thing. I'm wondering if it's going to do this for like all of the other 3 seasons. So far, it's only going through an autumn theme, which is more or less like Halloween theme because of the pumpkins and gores and stuff. So hopefully there's a winter patch. If there is, that would be pretty cool. It'd be interesting to see what type of color scheme you can have in it. But still, regardless, it's pretty interesting that it even features stuff like that in it. You can't really color customize in Dark Souls or Bloodborne, which is one of the reasons why Code Vein was pretty interesting, the fact that you can color customize your character builds. So overall, the game itself is actually pretty good. While, yes, it is short, there's a lot of stuff in the game that actually allows itself to be pretty good. And for $30, that's not bad. In fact, it kind of brings up the argument of, like, should games be shorter? And at first, I thought to myself, I was like, do they mean development, or do they mean the game's length in time? Because if they're talking about game's length in time, the answer is no, because you're charging a full-price game. However, though, in Mortal Shell's case, if you're going to make the game shorter, the game should be obviously cheaper. And based on that price range, it actually fits the bill, really. Yes, it's a small game, but based on the difficulty level, followed by all the extra small stuff that you can do in the game, it's not a bad price, actually. I think it's actually really good, in my personal opinion. So technically, I would give it a 4 out of 5, but unfortunately, I have to give this game a 3 out of 5 due to complications. One of those complications is, of course, bugs. There are a lot of bugs in this game, and unfortunately, it kind of ruins the experience for Mortal Shells for me. I'm hoping that they'll eventually patch them up, but of these bugs, one of them is game breaking and the other one potential game breaking. So really, one of them, while it doesn't really break the game, it does sour the experience. Technically, as I mentioned before, you have the ability to possess 4 other shells and their abilities. But whenever an enemy goes to try to kill you, you are first knocked out of that shell, and while everything is turned to stone for a brief second, you have that much time to try to dive back into the body in order to go for a second round. This is either perfect for either avoiding damage and running away from the enemy, or going for round 2 and finishing off the enemy for yourself. But the problem is that there are certain cases in which where you won't be able to dodge or run. Technically, you have a run animation, but while it looks like you are running, you are unfortunately going at a normal movement. So say, for example, you're running, but instead of running, you're just walking. You know what I mean? The animation of walking is still in presence while you're running. And also, too, during that time, you cannot dodge. This is a weird glitch that I noticed, and it only happened to me about 3 times so far in my entire gameplay. This, to me, can ruin the experience, especially when you're trying to avoid attacks, but you can't due to a bug that has happened in the game. And I'm hoping that gets patched in, because if it does, that might actually be better for gamers, but if it doesn't, it could sour the experience for certain gamers. There's also another bug that I've noticed as well, and that is, of course, involving with the enemies. Now, whenever you defeat an enemy, they kind of go into this ragdoll-like physics in which where they just kind of topple over. But, depending on how many enemies shows up on screen and how many you actually kill at a certain time, and using ability points at a certain number of times within a brief amount of seconds, the game kind of almost breaks, because then the enemies just kind of jumble down and their body parts starts to stretch all over the place. And it's like, that kind of scared me for a sec. I was like, is the game gonna break? Is the game gonna break? I mean, Wrecker, the Souls franchise, has been glitchy to some degree, but not to that level, you know, not to a point to where as the body crumples down into ragdoll physics realm, all of a sudden its body part starts to stretch out of proportion due to over extreme amount of detailing that happened in the game. So it's like, yeah, that's messed up right there. So again, if it wasn't for these glitches, I would definitely give it a 4 out of 5. Reason why I would say 4 out of 5 is simply because of the game's challenge. It is very Souls influenced, so if you're not used to the difficulty curve, then chances are this isn't going to be the game for you. But chances are, if you are a Souls veteran, this is a game that is refreshing for those who are looking for a Souls-like game, but with a new experience. While it's small, it is actually very satisfying in my personal opinion. But because of these bugs and glitches that could potentially ruin the gameplay, I think it would be a 3 out of 5. But depending on you, depends on if you feel obligated to want to try it out or not. Again, it's available for $30 right now, both physical and digital. As far as I know, PC, obviously digital, and I know for PS4, it's also physical and digital. So if you ever want to check it out, by all means, go right ahead. Well, anyway, guys, that's going to be it for this review. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought about Mortal Shells. Do you like it pretty well? What do you think about it? Interesting? Do you think we should see more small-style-like games that features a Souls-like element? Because, again, this game did really well in my personal opinion, and I think it could benefit for future titles. But who's to say? So long as they don't have any major bugs, I think we can all be on the same page. But anyway, thank you guys so much. See you next video. Take care, guys.